Imagine paying $35 for doing absolutely nothing. Not buying something, not receiving a service, not gaining an asset, nothing. You simply forgot. Maybe the bill arrived during a busy week. Maybe you were traveling. Maybe life got in the way. One day passes, and suddenly, $35 disappears from your account. A small penalty. At least that's how it feels. But now multiply that moment by millions of people. Every month. Every year. Across credit cards, utilities, subscriptions, loans, rent payments, and countless other financial products. Suddenly, that tiny penalty starts looking less like a punishment, and more like an industry. A very large industry. Because late fees generate billions of dollars every year. Not from people making catastrophic financial mistakes. Not from fraud. Not from crime. But from ordinary people being human. And that's what makes late fees so fascinating. They're one of the few business models built around a simple assumption. Someone will forget. To understand why this matters, we need to start with something surprisingly basic. Time. In finance, timing is everything. A payment made today is different from a payment made tomorrow. The difference may only be 24 hours. But financial systems treat those 24 hours as incredibly important. Miss a due date by a few minutes, and nothing happens. Miss it by a day, and suddenly penalties appear. Which seems strange. After all, the company isn't dramatically poorer because your payment arrived slightly late. The lights don't flicker. The building doesn't collapse. Civilization continues. Yet the fee appears anyway. Why? Because late fees are not primarily about recovering losses. They're about changing behavior. At least that's the official explanation. The logic sounds reasonable. If there were no penalties, more people would pay late. Deadlines would become suggestions. The system would become less predictable. And businesses love predictability. Fair enough. But then something interesting happens when we look at the numbers. Many late fees are far larger than the actual cost created by the delay itself. In some cases, a company may spend only a few dollars processing a late payment. Yet the penalty can be 10 times higher, sometimes more. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the fee exceeds the cost, what exactly is it paying for? The answer leads us into the economics of incentives. Imagine you own a business. You have two possible sources of revenue. The first comes from selling your product. The second comes from customers making mistakes. Which source would you prefer? Most people instinctively answer the first, but reality can become more complicated. Because mistake-based revenue can be surprisingly profitable. No additional inventory, no manufacturing costs, no new product development, just a fee triggered by behavior. And when millions of customers are involved, even small penalties can become enormous. This is where the story becomes slightly uncomfortable. Companies don't necessarily want customers to fail. Failure is bad business, but they often benefit when customers are imperfect. Late fees exist in a strange middle ground. The customer hasn't disappeared. The relationship remains intact. The bill still gets paid, but additional revenue appears. It's a remarkably efficient outcome for the company, not necessarily for the customer. And that's before we consider psychology. Humans are terrible at certain things. Remembering deadlines is one of them. Not because people are irresponsible, because attention is limited. Every day, modern consumers manage work schedules, family obligations, subscriptions, passwords, emails, notifications, and financial accounts. Somewhere inside that chaos sits a due date. Waiting. Quietly, patiently, and eventually, someone misses it. Behavioral economists have spent years studying this phenomenon. People do not make decisions in perfectly rational environments. They make decisions while distracted, tired, stressed, busy. Financial systems know this very well, which helps explain why modern billing systems often send reminders, emails, texts, notifications, calendar alerts. The technology exists to prevent late payments. Yet late fees continue generating enormous revenue. The reminders reduce the problem. They don't eliminate it, because the problem isn't information. It's human behavior. And human behavior is remarkably predictable. What's particularly fascinating is how people perceive these fees. Most don't view them as part of a product's price. They view them as exceptions, accidents, one-off mistakes, something separate. But from a business perspective, those exceptions happen with incredible regularity. When millions of customers behave imperfectly, predictable mistakes become predictable revenue. The exceptions become part of the model. Now consider credit cards. A customer misses a payment. A late fee appears. Interest continues accumulating. The credit score may take a hit. Future borrowing becomes more expensive. One missed payment can trigger consequences far beyond the original fee. A small mistake begins creating secondary effects, then tertiary effects. The penalty becomes larger than it initially appeared. And this is where timing becomes strangely valuable. Because companies aren't just selling products anymore. They're selling financial relationships. And financial relationships often reward consistency while punishing interruptions. The system runs smoothly when payments arrive exactly as expected. When they don't, friction appears. And friction often carries a price tag. But there's another layer, one that rarely gets discussed. Late fees reveal something important about modern economies. Many businesses have become experts at monetizing inconvenience. Not creating inconvenience, monetizing it. The distinction matters. Airlines charge change fees. Banks charge overdraft fees. Credit cards charge late fees. Streaming services charge reactivation fees. The details differ. The principle remains similar. A customer deviates from the ideal path. A charge appears. The business model quietly expands beyond the product itself. At some point, the penalties become part of the ecosystem. Not the main event, but not entirely accidental either. And historically, regulators have noticed. Over the years, governments around the world have questioned whether certain fees are proportional, whether they genuinely reflect costs, or whether they function primarily as profit centers. The debate continues. Companies argue that fees encourage responsible behavior. Critics argue that some penalties disproportionately affect people already struggling financially. Both sides contain elements of truth, which is why the issue never fully disappears. Because late fees occupy an unusual gray area. They're not entirely punishment. They're not entirely revenue. They're a blend of both. And perhaps that's why they persist. They solve a real problem, while simultaneously creating a profitable opportunity. A combination businesses rarely ignore. The irony is that the largest late fee customers are often the people least able to afford them. Someone with abundant cash rarely worries about a $35 penalty. Someone living paycheck to paycheck might. The same fee produces radically different consequences depending on who receives it. Yet the charge itself remains identical, which means the burden isn't evenly distributed. And that's where the story becomes bigger than late fees. Because this isn't really a story about $35. It's a story about incentives, about how financial systems respond to predictable human behavior, about what happens when millions of small mistakes become measurable revenue streams, and about the uncomfortable reality that some of the most profitable moments in finance occur when people aren't operating at their best, not when they're making brilliant decisions, when they're distracted, busy, overwhelmed, human. Which brings us back to that original question. What exactly is a late fee? A punishment? A deterrent? A revenue source? A behavioral tool? The answer is probably all of them. At the same time, and that's what makes them so difficult to think about clearly, because the fee itself looks tiny. One charge. One mistake. One forgotten due date. Yet behind that tiny charge sits an industry worth billions, built not on extraordinary events, but on ordinary human imperfections, the kind everyone experiences eventually. And perhaps that's the most interesting part. The modern economy contains countless systems designed to reward efficiency. But hidden among them are systems that quietly profit from inefficiency. The missed deadline, the forgotten payment, the overlooked notification, the simple mistake. And the next time a fee appears because a payment arrived a day late, it may be worth asking a question that extends far beyond that single charge. If billions of dollars are generated from people making predictable mistakes, are those mistakes really exceptions anymore? Or have they become part of the business itself?